So, Brad, I had a funny memory last night as I was going to bed. Do you remember when you and I used to exhibit...
Do you often think about me when you were about to go to bed? Is this a recurring thing?
Brad, there's not a night that I don't fall asleep thinking of that Van Dyke, that glorious Van Dyke.
You just get done with your little prayers there, and God bless Gloria, and God bless the kids and the in-laws. Now, about Brad Geiger.
No, it's like this. I'm holding my hands together. God bless my wife. God bless the earth. Now, if you'll excuse me for a minute, God. Oh, Brad Geiger.
There's nothing godly about
this.
Now,
God, if you'll give me just one moment. Oh, Brad Geiger and his Van Dyke. No.
God, if you just forgive me.
I just need 5 minutes, God. What I was thinking of was a delightful memory of the years when you and I would exhibit at Comic-Cons together, where we're sharing a booth, right?
Yeah.
You and I are at a 20 by 10 or a 10 by 10 booth for a full 3, 4, 5 days. And booth barnacles, one of my favorite phrases that Brad came up with, are folks that stick on to the booth. They just, for whatever reason, they're fans, but they just never got the social hint of like, all right, well, we're done here, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So you came up with one of the most brilliant ideas I think I've ever seen at a Comic-Con, which is like, hold on, I've got an idea. Give me your phone. And you Google a photo of like Grandpa or Gam Gam or something like that. I don't remember what it was. And you changed your photo profile on my phone to this old grandpa, like waving to the camera from an easy chair, like an electronic, electric easy chair. And then you changed Brad Geiger to say like Gampa or Gam Gam or Grandpa or something like that, right? And so then the next time we had a booth barnacle, Brad, I'm like, okay, well, thanks so much. Yeah, no, I really appreciate you coming by. All right, well, have a great show. I'm doing all the social cues of like, well, it's been 10 minutes.
Yeah.
There are people waiting behind you. Let's move this along.
Yeah.
Brad, you would step back quietly, be like, kind of cough and turn.
Yep.
And you'd get your phone out at like waist level, turned around backwards, and you'd call me. And I would get out my phone and be like, you know what? I'm so sorry. I've got to take this call. It's my grandfather. He never calls unless it's an emergency.
He's 80 years old. How many phone calls am I going to get after all?
You know what? I got to take this call. I'm so sorry, especially in the middle of a Comic-Con. We're having such a lovely conversation. I've got to take this call.
Yeah.
Yes, Gam Gam, how are you? And then you step away.
And then we always had a little area behind a curtain where we would keep like the boxes and we could step back there and have lunch or something. You always want to have a little private area whenever you can at a comic convention booth. So he would step back there. I would step up, handle the people. If there was people waiting, I would assure them Dave's going to be right back. In the meantime, feel free to flip through a book, blah, blah. Make sure you didn't lose anybody. Dave goes in the back. I would wait.
Has 5 or 6 Oreos. Brad says, well, I'm sure Dave would love to see you again later. Have a great show. Shoo them off.
When the barnacle finally drifts away, I go in the back, tell Dave he's up, he comes out, and boom, back to comic convention time.
And so we did it vice versa for both of us.
Yeah.
But here is the fun coda to this whole story, Brad. If you were to call me right now, do you know what photo comes up on my phone?
What photo comes up?
It's that grandfather. I haven't changed it. It's been on my phone. I'm not kidding. It's been on my iPhone for like 8 years now. It's this photo of this old man in this easy chair waving at me. And so now I have like this quiet association of grandpa energy with Brad.
Yeah. You're not alone. You're not alone.
Well, on that note, I'm going to say hello, everybody, and welcome to ComicLab, the show about making comics.
And making a living from comics. I'm Brad Geiger, the editor of webcomics.com and the creator of Evil Inc.
And I'm his pal, Dave Kellett, the cartoonist of Drive and Sheldon and the co-director of Stripped.
And this week's Hour of Comics Advice is made possible by your support at patreon.com/comiclab. So Dave, let's talk comics.
Let's talk comics, my friend. We are heading into the final stretches, the final weeks of the year. Yeah. And I want to give a huge shout out and a thank you to Wacom, who has been with us all through this 2020. It's been great to have them as sponsors of the show. They, of course, are the makers of the Wacom One, which is a $400 super lightweight, presentable, pro-am, but also pro-level Cintiq. And it has been a great thing to have in both Brad and my studios during the pandemic. And as longtime Cintiq users, it is a sponsorship that we can endorse wholeheartedly. So we give a huge shout out and a thank you to Wacom at wacom.com.
Absolutely. So, Dave, we've got all kinds of really great questions for the show. Here's one that I want to pitch to you. This is something that a thought that kind of floated past. Throughout your career, you've wanted lots of things. You wanted maybe something to happen. You wanted fame. You wanted fortune. God only knows what you've wanted over there.
God, oh God.
But since we're at the recording of this show, we're heading into Thanksgiving, I started thinking about blessings in disguise. And I want to ask you, Dave, what has been your blessing in disguise over your career? What thing did you really, really want you didn't get? And then you look back and you're like, oh, thank God I didn't get that.
Oh, yeah. So you're saying like the thing that the career goal type thing that I really wanted.
Anything that happened that you wanted it so bad you could taste it and you didn't get it, and it would crush you at the time. And now with the benefit of hindsight, you look back and you're like, oh my gosh, if I would have gotten that, it would have been so bad. It would have ruined everything I got now. It would have been terrible.
That's a fun thing to look at. All right, so I have two things in my career.
I've got two too. I bet you really? I bet you one of ours match.
Let's do. I bet you we both have one. In fact, I'm almost sure. I'm gonna lead with the one that I'm sure matches with you, and then we'll go into our second one. So the first one that I'm so glad did not happen because I wanted it more than anything for decades.
Yes.
And it didn't happen. And that was to get syndicated into newspapers, Brad, when they were still a going concern.
Bing, 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 bing,
and,
bing, bing. We've got a match.
And for all the reasons that you could imagine. To me, that was what cartooning was. That was Charles Schulz. That was Kathy Geiswhite. That was Lynn Johnson. That was Mort Walker. That's where I wanted to be. That's where my heroes, my personal heroes, did what they did, and I wanted to be in newspapers. Mm-hmm. And it just so happens that we came along at a time where Stefan Pastis said it once in the movie Stripped, where he's like, I got into the NBA, and then the stadium crumbled, right?
Yeah.
And I feel like had I gotten into newspapers, I would have maybe had a middling launch, and maybe had a middling career, and maybe made between $15,000 and maybe $30,000, $35,000 a year, and just enough where I would have had to get a second job, you know, and also do 7 days a week, you know.
Yes.
And so I would have hated that path, and it would have been really unsatisfying, and I would not have been able to work full time as a cartoonist. And anyway, how about you? What was your angle on that?
I was just going to add, and you would have been trapped.
Trapped, yes.
You would have been trapped because you couldn't get out, because you'd be caught in this limbo. You were making just enough, but you weren't making enough. And depending on the company that you signed with, you may or may not have signed away part of the rights to your comic, because sometimes that's part of the going concern. Or they sneak this stuff in, like the right of first refusal, which
or time limits where you would have had to, you know. Oh God, yes.
Yeah. And by the way, if these are phrases you're not familiar with, go back to that ComicLab where we had Katie Lane talking to us about legal terms. Learn before you sign a contract, ComicLab listener. You learn what a right of first refusal is. Go back and listen to her talking about what that could entail for you. Think twice before you sign that contract. But that's the contract that you would have signed. And it might have signed away some of your rights. Even if it didn't, you would have been trapped in a syndicate contract. You'd be in halfway, like so many people that we know right now, right, Dave?
I know, it breaks my heart. So can I assume then that this would have been your what's the great way to say it? Dodged bullet. This was a bullet that you dodged as well?
That's a bullet that I dodged. I wanted, just like you grew up in the 70s and 80s when newspapers were a dominant media form. And that was the definition of success to get syndicated. It grinds me, especially if I'm talking to a young person, it grinds me when they still either talk about syndication that way, or if they're a young cartoonist and they think about syndication as this goal to be achieved. Because I started talking to my wife and I had to correct myself because I said, oh my God, Carolyn, that idea of syndication as success is 20 years out of date. Yeah. I heard the words come out of my mouth and I said, no, wait a minute. It's not 20 years out of date. You got to go back. It's 40 years out of date. You got to go
Yes.
all the way back to the 1980s. Then you're forgiven for saying syndication is success. 90s, it was already starting to crumble. The
It was getting
cracks were
shaky. It was
showing in
getting
the
shaky,
90s.
yeah.
Yeah.
There were still hits. There was like breakouts like Get Fuzzy
Yep.
and, a couple other ones. Richard Thompson's Cul-de-sac. There were still some ones that were like getting a toehold, but not as many as there were in the 80s,
And if you started in the 90s, you're lucky if you're, Get Fuzzy or Cul-de-sac, but there was a whole bunch that we've long since forgotten about. And then by the 90s and the 2000s, it's starting to fall apart. So, I get really upset when I hear people, I really hope I get syndicated someday. It's like, no, you don't. And not only do you don't, but for 40 years.
Yeah.
This has been untrue.
But I want to switch to your second one in a second here. But one thing I want to talk about is and I'll be honest about it. It took me the better part of a decade to shake the feeling that I still wasn't missing out.
Yeah. Well, yeah, because again, it's forgivable if you're in your 40s and your 50s and you have this attitude. It's forgivable because you grew up in that atmosphere. If you're in your 20s and 30s, you get a little bit less leeway from me.
Yeah. Well, to the truth of it, though, Brad, I don't know that I've found any 20-year-old cartoonist that's like, I want to go in a newspaper. Have you found some? Really?
Within the last month, I was having this conversation
with 20-year-old?
with somebody who's... Listen, I don't want to put him down. He's on the Discord server. I don't want to put this. This person does a wonderful comic, but I had a long private chat with him about this very issue.
But at what point do you go, the buggy whip industry? That's where I want to go. That's where the money is. Buggy whips.
You don't want to poop on somebody's parade. You don't want to come in and be that guy that's like,
no, I know. On some level, it's like you still, even though everyone else wants to go to Hollywood and Big Bird wants to go to New York to break into public television, you still got to root for Big Bird. You're like, go find your dream.
Yeah.
I hope your magic works for you. That's great.
The best you can do is what I did. Keep your eyes open. Look at that contract. Understand what that means. But you don't want to be Debbie Downer. You gotta skate the line between being Debbie Downer and giving this person important information.
It's also, let's be fair, it is a subjective dream, and so even though it's not ours anymore. Right. God bless them. Let them go for it. Who cares? If that's their dream, great. Well, let me hear your second one that you gave up and you're like, oh, darn it. At the time, you're like, oh, dang it, this is the worst. But now you're like, whew, I dodged a bullet.
This is going to be super specific to me. This was something that happened in my life. I've talked a little bit about it, but I was at the Daily News. When I went into newspapers, the reason I went into newspapers was so I could become a cartoonist. And at that point, I was really hyped up on being an editorial cartoonist, doing politics. And that's kind of how I got into it. But then I got doing newspaper graphics, and I found out I was really good at newspaper graphics. And of course, I'm 20 years old. I am super fast. I'm very good using Apple computers and the Macintosh line that was coming out, and that was all relatively new in the 90s.
Wow, that's dating Brad Geiger here.
Yeah, but I was way ahead of the curve, and and all this new software came very, very quickly to me, and I became a monster on Deadline. I could crank out Deadline graphics, and they were sending me out to do investigative stuff. I was doing they would send me to breaking news, and I would do investigative, journalistic, informational graphics on the fly. And I was getting really good, and I was becoming known in the newspaper industry, blah, blah, blah. Long story short, they brought me to the Philadelphia Daily News to basically build a graphics department and to build a team of people to do this thing that I was doing in Ohio. And that was the whole, when they brought me over, and I've told more details about this. We were also getting married at the time. There's a whole thing, but they brought me over, and the whole, the concept for me accepting the job was, you're going to work for a year in the department, and then I'm going to promote you. This is the graphics editor talking. Okay. I'm going to promote you. You're going to become the assistant, and you're going to start building this thing that we've got a vision for. And I'm like, great, sounds good. And I worked there for a year. And one night On a Friday night, as I was going home, my boss told me, I'm going to make the announcement on Monday. You're going to be the assistant graphics editor. Fantastic. And I went home, told Carolyn, we celebrated. That was a big deal. We went out to that nice restaurant that night, the RB with the drive-through.
Got the extra breadsticks.
Yeah, we got
the whole 9 yards.
I said, honey, get the curly fries tonight. And Monday, I drive in. He's out in the parking lot waiting for me. And he goes, did you tell anybody about the promotion? I said, well,
no.
my wife.
Oh, no.
He says, you told nobody else? I said, no, who am I going to talk to? And he says, it's not going to happen. It's not happening. The reasons for which I'm not going to go into here, although it was not punitive, it was that management above him had other ideas of what they wanted to do.
Oh, no.
And they said, no, we're going to go a different direction. We want something else to happen. And I was crushed. And it was gee whiz. It was 1999. And of course, 99, the internet is already putting the writing on the wall for newspapers at that time. I had a bunch of syndicate submissions that I had put together for Greystonian that I'd sat with, getting cobwebs on them.
Oh,
and I took a long, hard look at my life at that point. And at that point, Dave, I had either worked at or interviewed or turned down jobs at all of the major newspapers.
Right.
The New York Times, Seattle Times, Los Angeles, Baltimore Sun, I turned down. USA Today was an absolute nightmare. There was I'd either gone to DEF CON 3 or decided I didn't want to do it in the first place with them. So my career path in newspapers was very limited to do what I wanted to do. If it wasn't going to be in Philadelphia, it wasn't going to be anywhere.
Right.
And I took a look at that syndicate submission and I said, fuck it. I'm going to be a cartoonist like I kind of meant to be when I started doing this almost 10 years ago when I got into the newspaper in 91. I said, I let that dream go and newspapers is a dead end for me now. It's time for me to start working on this comic again. So I got a GeoCities website and I started uploading that syndicate submission one day a week, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. I had, 10 weeks of stuff.
Right.
And when I got to the end of the 10th week, I had no plan. I had no plans. And I got to the end of the 10th week and I'm like, I'm really enjoying this. And I started working on week 11. The week before. I gave, basically, long story short, in hindsight, gave up a 10-week buffer. But I started working on week 11 and then updated every day for years after that without missing, because, again, that was the landscape that we had in the early 2000s. And looking back now in 2020, it was the best thing. If I would have been, again, same thing with the syndicate thing. If I would have taken that job, I would still be trapped in newspapers today.
Yeah.
I would be completely trapped. I'd have no options, no resume, no experience and proficiency in cartooning that I would have built up, a resume that nobody wanted, and 50 years old. I would be in a horrible position right now if I had gotten that job. But thank goodness I didn't, and that's what started me. That one weekend, I took a look at my life and said, "All right, newspapers aren't going to happen. Time to go back to that thing that's been sitting on my drawing desk for years."
Yeah, it's so funny because there's no way to go back and tell that younger Brad,
No.
look, and just keep enjoying the breadsticks. Everything's going to be okay.
Because I was crushed.
Because you see the path that you're like, I can see it. I see where this is going, and I'm ready to do it. Oh, it's being pulled away from me.
Yep.
It's funny though how sometimes the moments in our careers that are not our choice are actually the ones that are sort of grist for the mill. They help sharpen the blade to get us working harder, or finding out what it is that we really want versus what it is that the world just happens to be offering at that moment.
Yeah.
And so boy, I can't imagine you would be so unhappy right now if you were stuck in a graphics department in a newspaper.
By the time I was really getting up at the edge of being able to leave newspapers, I was miserable. Those last couple of years, I was really, truly miserable, and miserable to be around. Like my wife would say, she would try to start conversations with me, and I would just have nothing to say, because either I was so burnt out or so dog tired from trying to do comics and newspapers and be a family man. I was miserable to be around, and when I left, it was the best time of my life was when I woke up that one morning and was like, oh, I don't have to go into work. I still have like dreams and stuff of being late for work or having to go to work or all this stuff. And then I wake up feeling so happy I don't have to do that anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
So what's your other dodged bullet? You said you had two. One of them, like me, was syndication. What was the other dodged bullet for Dave Kellett?
The other one came about a decade before syndication did not work out, which is younger Dave. I was up for a scholarship that would have taken me to England, and I was going to try to study comics, and I got Notre Dame, my university, nominated me. I got down to the state finals, and 100 people were the finalists, and they were going to pick something like 26, 32 finalists and send them over to England, and I didn't get it.
Ooh.
And I was heartbroken, Brad.
Do you remember who got it?
What's that?
Do you remember who got it?
Yeah, there's like 26, 32 people. The guy that got it in lieu of me was going to be studying microfinancing and microloans to the third world at Oxford.
Oh.
And a part of me was like, oh, that's more important. That's fine.
Yeah.
You know what? I get it. That's fine. And so anyway, he got it. But here's why, only in retrospect, it's funny because after I didn't got it, after I didn't got it, you can see why I didn't get the scholarship, Brad. After I didn't got it.
Amazing they didn't want you in Oxford, yeah.
The dean of the law school, who I had never spoken to before, sent me an email, said, "Can I see you tomorrow at 11 a.m.?" And I was like, sure, okay, what the hell is this about? So I go over to the law school, a much nicer building than any of the other ones on campus.
Yeah.
And he sits me down in this gorgeous wood office, and he goes, "Hey, be glad you didn't get that scholarship. Had you gotten that scholarship, you would have become a lawyer. And I can tell you, I've been watching you from a distance. You don't want to be a lawyer."
Yeah.
And so here's what else would have happened, Brad.
What a beautiful thing for this guy to reach out and do.
It was actually really, yes, that's what I thought, too.
You know what I mean? What a thoughtful, empathetic thing to do for another human being.
That's what I thought.
Yeah.
And so he said, granted, it's a missed opportunity, but you wouldn't have wanted the path that this would have pushed you down, kind of like you with graphics. He saw what I didn't see, which is that it would have steered me down a path that I wouldn't have wanted.
Yeah.
Anyway, long story short, the more important thing that happened from this is that I doubled down. I'm like, no, I'm going to get somebody to pay for grad school for me, damn it. And so I took a year off working in LA and San Diego, and I found out about another scholarship that the Rotary Foundation was putting together, and I applied, and I got to go to England again, this time to Canterbury, to study World War II cartooning, right? But the better part, Brad, the thing that's magical about this is that Gloria also got to go do grad school in England. And that turned out to be the most magical year of our young lives. We were living in London and Canterbury. We kind of had City Mouse and Country Mouse. We would go spend 3 days in London or spend 4 days in Canterbury.
Yeah.
And as far as one of the most foundationally important things in my life, which is my wife, who is my creative partner, my best friend, like the inspiration for a billion ideas that I've had, and just general overall happiness, that year was critical. So had I gotten that first scholarship, which I was heartbroken not to get, I wouldn't have had that magical year with my wife in England,
That's beautiful.
And so I see that as a tremendous godsend, because I wouldn't have had that year with her. It would have been like, I don't know. I don't know where that path would have led, but it would have led to not having that year. And God, what a thing to have missed.
Yeah. What a neat thing to kind of think about, especially in a year like 2020, when there has been so many disappointments and so many upheavals and so many doors that have been slammed shut. It's a really kind of a good thing to keep in mind as you're going through something that, for all intents and purposes, you think this is the end, right?
It surely feels apocalyptic, yes.
Yeah, and it's like, this is the end. What a neat thing to be able to remind people is that so many times in life, and by the way, we're just talking comics. If we open this up and say, okay, now what are some other times you had a blessing in disguise or dodged a bullet, we'd be able to talk about a bunch of other things as well. That's like, oh, I'm really glad this thing that I wanted didn't happen. It's kind of a nice thing to remind people of in such a horrendous year, that as bad as what you're going through right now, there's a really good chance that 5 or 6 years down the road, you're going to look at 2020 and say, man, it felt bad at the time, but I'm really glad because look at where I am now.
Yeah, I mean, just on the top of my head, the things that I know will come out of this for me personally is the pace of my life will change.
Yeah.
And for the better in a lot of ways. And then even when it speeds back up again, I will appreciate that it can be modulated back down, that it doesn't always have to be a rat race.
Yeah.
And that I also think that my awareness of my relationships in my life has been very altered because of 2020 in a way that makes me a better and more grateful and thankful person. And that's nice, So how about you? Just out of curiosity, what has 2020 changed, if you had to guess, about your personality?
Well, for one, it helped me to put priorities in order, and to decide what was important and what isn't important. Because so many times we've had to make decisions like, do we do this thing or do we don't do the thing? It might be a family occasion and everybody wants to really, really do it. But you look at it and you say, we gotta say no to ourselves. And sometimes a moment like that, when you are really making that decision in your head, it helps to prioritize and helps you to remember what's really important in life.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. So this occasion that we're missing, it stinks that we got to miss it. Right. We've had to cancel a lot of things. We canceled that talk out at the Charles Schulz Museum. Right. I hated turning that down. I hated not being able to do it. But I got a feeling at some point we're going to be out there one day doing a live podcast from the Schulz Museum a couple of years down the road, and we're going to realize that the decision we made not to travel in 2020 was the best decision we ever made because we're going to be alive and healthy, so we can do that show down the road.
And it's not. I don't think it's overdoing it to say that when we first get off the planes in Santa Rosa, you from Philadelphia, me from LA, and I get to see you for the first time in years, that hug is going to be tremendous.
Yes.
And that first glass of Northern California wine is going to taste so sweet because having gone through this. So absolutely. I think it's going to be there are moments of appreciation that come from tragedy, and as shitty as this year is, and none of us want to live through it or have gone through it again, for example, but there are glimmers of appreciation and gratefulness that I think my heart will benefit from for decades to come.
Absolutely.
Hey, if you're listening while you work, take a minute to stand and stretch.
And while you're doing that, we're going to tell you why you should join us on Patreon.
When you do, you're going to get hours and hours of podcasts that we recorded just for backers.
And exclusive Patreon posts that go even deeper on ComicLab topics.
And access to our exclusive Discord server, which is a thriving community of professional cartoonists.
So you can support the show you love and get tons of actionable resources for your own cartooning.
And listen, if you can't swing a pledge this month, we get it. No worries.
Yeah, listen, you can still support the show by rating us wherever you get your podcasts.
Just leave a 5-star review and a few kind words.
That, along with mentions on social media, is incredibly helpful.
Now, everybody, let's talk comics. Well, Brad, I got a question here from one of our listeners, but before I ask this of you, I don't know why I didn't mention this before. Is there a large series of pines or perhaps oak trees that you need to cut down today? Because I'm seeing Brad Geiger in a tremendous amount of flannel today in a way that I literally have never seen you before in flannel.
You've never seen me in flannel?
And I feel like the sheer amount of testosterone that's coming through this camera from Philadelphia at me is amazing. What's going on over there?
My God, I could just I exude manliness in this flannel. No, in my building that I'm at, we're in that weird spot between the end of summer and the beginning of winter, where we like last week it got up to the 70s around here. So the building manager hasn't turned on the furnace yet, but it's cold enough that if sitting here in my studio, it's pretty. In fact, I was just rubbing my fingers. My fingers are chilly.
You're like Bob Cratchit. Like, could we put on another piece of coal?
I literally am. So yeah, they haven't turned the furnace on, so I've got to dress for warmth over here.
Just out of curiosity, how old is that building? If you had to guess, 100 years or so?
Have I ever told you the story about this building?
No.
This building is very, very old. It dates back to before World War II. They used to build ball bearings in this building.
Sure, of course.
Because it's all ball bearings.
It's all ball bearings.
But now I've looked into the history, and I have been able to verify this, at least partially. But what happened was they were, kind of, and by the way, everything around here was all textiles and dyes and factories. This was a very happening industrial part of Philadelphia.
Right.
and so what happened was going into World War II, of course, everybody had to be laid off. It was the Great Depression. I'm sorry, I got to back it up. Great Depression. The guy that owned this building and this factory did not want to lay people off, but he brought them all the way back to working like maybe just one day a week. But he wouldn't.
So that everybody would have enough
off,
to eat, kind of a
but
thing.
Everybody would have a little bit of money coming in, but he refused to lay anybody off. Coming into World War II, as we're starting to climb out of the Great Depression, this guy, they developed or were able to build a special ball bearing that never really wore down. And this was important because they could use them in submarines. Because before, the submarines would have to surface on a regular basis because their ball bearings would wear down. These ball bearings, they installed one.
I'm sorry, but as you're describing the story, I'm seeing 1,000 jokes, and I'm trying so hard not to interrupt. But keep going.
Yes, try to keep that to yourself. But they installed one in the 40s in this hydroelectric dam under a waterfall, and it's still going today. It still hasn't worn down. It just goes and goes and goes. So all of a sudden, this person has all kinds of orders to build these ball bearings. Not only, according to what I've read, not only did he hire everybody back full time, but he went back and paid them for the time that they missed before, that they weren't able to work.
Where is that in corporate America anymore? Where is that?
He went back and gave everybody back pay and caught everybody up for all that work that they missed. And because that was coming in hand over fist, now because he's got this magical ball bearing that everybody wants. That happened in this building after they tore that out, and they moved that to England, by the way. I think it's Kingsbury was the name of it. But anyway, they moved to Great Britain.
That is not a story you hear often, manufacturing leaving America for England. That's not the tale of the last 50 years.
Yeah, it was a weird buyout. But then this became a bag manufacturing place. They did like plastic Ziploc bags.
Gotcha. Well, the reason I was asking is, as a West Coaster, there's not a lot of buildings around here that have like the old style furnace that's down in the basement that's gigantic.
Yeah.
But for me, again, as a West Coaster, I always think of those kind of buildings like in a horror movie, because whenever someone's like, I gotta go down and turn on the furnace, and that's always where the serial killer is. So maybe that's why your business manager or your building manager is not going down.
That's also where my books are. that's also the warehouse for my books, right next to...
Brad gets a little concerned when suddenly the building gets very warm. He's like, wait, what are they using?
This used to be a gas furnace.
Well, Brad, let me jump into a question here I got from patreon.com/ComicLab listener Jay Lark, and Jay writes, hey, Brad and Dave, I'm looking forward to getting my 4Cs magnet. By the way, those should all be arriving. If they have not yet, they should be arriving very shortly into your home there. Speaking about the 4Cs, what are some ideas for consistently sharing content during those periods when you don't have a completed comic page ready yet? I'm following your advice of not stressing out about posting a comic every single week, but I'd still like to offer something to my followers to keep them interested while the new page is in the work. Cheers, says Jay. Brad, what answer do you have for Jay on the comic page is not ready, it's not done yet, but if you'd like to keep your Twitter feed going or your social media feed going, what do you put up, Brad?
This is a really common. This is exactly why cartoonists tend to suck at social media.
Oh, right. Strong words from Brad Geiger.
Jay's not alone. Jay's not alone in this. Jay, in needing to widen his view a little bit. But this is a common thing. This is why cartoonists and creative people in general fail at social media because Jay thinks the only thing interesting about him is his comic. That's the only thing he could possibly think about for content. It's the only interesting thing that's coming out of his head is his comic. And so when he thinks I need to post content, that's all he can think of is the comic. Okay. The problem is, Jay, there's a lot more that's interesting about you than just the comic. You've got a bunch of thoughts that are worth sharing. You've got a bunch of actions, some activities, some things, some experiences. There's a lot of stuff that falls under the heading of content that is perfectly shareable to the degree that you want to share and is perfectly fair game. Okay. When we're talking about, remember, when we're talking about the 4 C's, content, commercial, curation, and the 4th C, as always, is kindness. The content is stuff that you're posting for people to read on social media. Doesn't have to be the comic. It can be your thoughts. It can be your experiences. There's a lot more interesting about you than just the comic.
Well, can I play? This is not devil's advocate, but it's a curious advocate, I guess. I don't know what a curious advocate is.
Curious advocate.
But so when you say there's a lot of stuff that's interesting about you, how do you delineate between? Okay, I can post interesting things from my life between that and like here's what I had for lunch, which is like the most. The stereotypical boring tweet or about this or that. How do you, Brad, delineate like when to post the interesting thing and how to do it?
It depends on what's going in my life. It depends on how often I've posted other things in the past. But here's the deal. Social media has been built on inane conversation, right? In other words, here's what I had for lunch. Yes, I agree. That's something that is a little bit inane, but you'll be surprised because the inane posts tend to get a lot of engagement because somebody's going to take a look at that sandwich on a plate and ask you why you used the olives that you used, or why it is that you like fried bologna instead of just bologna out of the package, or whatever it is. There's different levels of inanity. And what I would suggest that Jay and everybody do is to see what your audience is responding to, and if it's a picture of what you had for lunch, then that's what it is. I used to take. I was trying to get back into exercising a little while ago, and this was years ago. I'm doing something different now.
You're like, I've given up on that. This was years
completely
ago.
Forget about it. But like to encourage myself to go out and take a walk every day, I would find one photograph along my walk and post that on social media.
I remember that when you were doing that. Yeah.
And say, in fact, that's when I found out that within a stone's throw, there was a chocolate factory not too far away from here.
And that's when the exercising stopped.
Well, I think they say they invented Raisinets, but that's a whole nother Philadelphia story.
What a weird thing to say you invented.
They invented
Philadelphia, home of the Raisinets.
Nobody thought of putting chocolate on a raisin before these guys. But no, and so you would be surprised, these really dumb photos. Like sometimes you see on the side of a building, particularly a brick building, somebody had painted an advertisement on the side of a building, and it's all worn faded down. It's like a ghostly image now. Well, there's all kinds of buildings like that around Philadelphia. So you take a nice little shot of that, and it's like, oh man, that's really interesting. That got such good engagement. It was so dumb. It's things I saw while I was walking around. There's nothing dumber than that. There's nothing interesting about it, except it is interesting.
Sure,
because you're going to make it interesting. You're going to post something, and you're going to maybe say something. Listen, if you're a creative person, what brought you to the game? Because you wanted an opportunity to be creative. Well, what's more creative than taking a dumb photo and finding something interesting to say about it? It's an exercise in creativity.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What you should be thinking about this all the time. And in other words, this is a way to kind of hone your creative muscle. What am I going to do today that's interesting? I don't know. There's 100 things. And again, remember what Brad always tells you. All ideas are worthless. It's the execution of the idea. Your job today is to take a dumb idea and execute it brilliantly and then put it on social media.
I want to agree with you, and I think I will reframe it slightly different, is that whether it is a commentary, whether it's a photo, whether it's an insight, my attitude is at least try to put a little spin on it, a little bit of entertainment, a little bit of something that they couldn't have gotten from anywhere else but you.
Right.
And that makes a tweet or a social media share worthwhile, is that the content there is that it's uniquely from you, of you, with your life, and has your framing on it, right? And so to Brad's point, it's not that any idea is new, it's that, what is it that you bring to the table with the execution of that idea?
Right.
And what's interesting, Brad, since you mentioned it about photography, and I'm not in any way diminishing the unique skill set that is photography, but it is interesting that cartoonists can very often take, maybe somewhat by accident, a really good photo because we are used to having to try to frame things up in a way that uniquely balances the weight and the heft and the tone of a photograph in the same way that you would do with a comic panel. So it never surprised me in your walkabouts in Philadelphia. You would have these amazingly framed photos, and I'd be like, again, not diminishing the unique skill set that is a photographer, because of course a DP or a photographer, it's a skill set that is its own. But it's interesting how our skill set is parallel, and that you could take really good photos, frankly.
Yeah, and of course the other go-to is sketches from your sketchbook.
Sketches are great. Yep.
Sketches
Process
as
is
you're
a great
working.
one. People love Process.
People love Process
What's
videos.
boring to you as a cartoonist, to other people, like, oh, that's how the sausage is made,
Exactly. They love it. It's magic to them. It's every day to you, but seeing this image take place in front of their eyes is something that they love. Process videos is brilliant. Sketches. If you're working analog, if you're working in pen and ink or pencil, take a little bit of time, again, like Dave says, and compose your image. If you're taking a photo of your sketchbook, you don't want to lay the sketchbook down flat and then put the camera at like a perpendicular angle to it and shoot it so that like your sketchbook is in perspective. You want to have your sketchbook and your camera parallel so that you've got so that it basically looks like a flat area in the photograph. Am I explaining that right?
Yeah,
you see people every now and again, they're taking pictures of their sketchbook and their sketchbook is laying flat on the table. It's like, no. Put that right parallel to the sketchbook. Give me a nice idea of what that sketch is. But there's lots of things. And if there's nothing else, remember, pay attention to what your audience is responding to, because your audience is going to respond to different things than my audience is, who's going to respond to different things than Dave's audience is. So and remember, if you take a swing and miss the ball, it's social media. It's gone in 7 seconds.
Especially, Brad, because Twitter has now announced those new fleets, which are different than tweets.
It's the equivalent of Instagram stories, right? You post. In fact, they're even framing it exactly the way like Instagram is. It's called a fleet, and it's going to be gone in 24 hours. What do you think about this, Dave? I'm down on it. It's a thumbs down from Brad. I think that this is where all of your horrible, ghoulish, hateful, nasty things that you want plausible deniability, you figure, it's going to disappear in 24 hours. Nobody's going to catch me. It's where that stuff is going to go. Did you see any upside in having a tweet that only lasts 24 hours?
Yeah, and I think I like that you did it. It's a thumbs down from Brad. What were the two film critics that had that?
Roger Ebert and Gene Siskel.
Siskel and Ebert. That's right. So we can start doing that. That's fine. Yeah. It's a thumbs up from Dave, and I'll tell you why. I think it's the old man in you that is reacting to it, because all of the younger creators and people that grew up with the internet appreciate that there are things that don't stick around. Yeah. That it's not permanently going to be on their resume or on a Google search or anything like that. And also they recognize that the internet does not need a permanent. Sometimes life can be ephemeral. And, like, here is a leaf blowing in the wind. I just wanted to share it. And it doesn't need to be permanently attached to my feed forever. Yeah. It's just something I wanted to share. So I do think it is something that I have come to appreciate mainly from younger internet users, that sometimes a passing fancy, a whimsy that's not up to huge world-changing proportions, but it's fun to share. Mm-hmm. It's almost a conversational, quip that gets forgotten in moments, but it makes life pleasurable. And so I think I tend to view it as an innovation by younger internet users that I have come to appreciate. I like you at first, I was like, what is this Instagram stories? It feels like wasted work. Why would I post it to Instagram stories? I want to build an archive, right? I want to. That's the attitude I came from. But now I've come to see, depending on how you use it, Instagram stories and these new fleets from Twitter, they have a place, and the place is whimsy, and the place is impermanence, and the place is appreciate it while it's here. I kind of understand it. So it's a thumbs up from Dave, to use Brad's metaphor.
All right. One thing we both agree on, the term fleets will not be long for this world. They're already referring to these as Twitter stories. Just the same as Facebook stories and Instagram stories. Everybody who's tweeting about it is calling them stories. So nobody's going to, within 2 weeks, no one's going to know what a fleet is. That's my...
Can I ask you a question? And I may be wrong about this. Have you ever had a surgery, Brad, a physical surgery on your abdomen or anything like that?
No, but I know where you're going because I've been in the pharmacy.
There was one time, like 3 months before I got married, my damn kidney literally fell out of place. It fell off all the connective tissue, and I had to have this massively invasive surgery through my abdomen. But the thing they gave me the day before, Brad, was called a fleet.
Yeah,
and it cleans you out, my friend. I'll let you imagine what that was. So the first thing I reacted to when I saw the name Fleets, I was like, take an extra 5 minutes, copywriter. Why are you I mean, I get it because it's fleeting and it rhymes with tweet. I get why they did it. But I was like, oh boy.
But it's pointless because everyone's going to call them Twitter stories.
Twitter stories, yeah, I know.
It doesn't matter. So, Dave, I've got a question from one of our Patreon backers over at patreon.com/ComicLab, and it goes like this. Hi, Dave and Brad. I've taken your suggestions into my current short comic about scripting, but I've come across some interesting conundrums with the art, specifically the backgrounds. When is it appropriate to completely drop the background? I have some quite detailed buildings that are needed to understand the logistics of a fight scene. So in the interest of time, I've been looking at other comics to see how they handle it, and I've seen the backgrounds completely disappear for a panel or two and then come back later. Is there a rule to this? When is it okay to drop a background, and when do you really need a background?
This is a great question, and I am surprised that we have gotten 3 years into ComicLab and no one has asked this question before.
We've never talked backgrounds before.
We've never talked about the specific interplay between backgrounds and foregrounds. Okay, so first of all, you are on the right path. This is something to be concerned about. The way I look at backgrounds is, like anything in comics, it's a little bit like Chekhov's gun. If you include something in a comic, it's because it needed to be there to communicate something. If you include a prop and the prop is, I don't know, swim fins for going to the beach, and those swim fins aren't going to be used by panel 4 by the end of that page, then you've kind of confused the reader. They're like, well, wait, why were they holding swim fins in panel 1? Right? You know,
why did you tell me this?
Yeah, exactly. So for me, a background, the dance of a background is, it's just enough to communicate place, location, mood, tone. Is it raining? Does the rain impact how the mood of the characters are?
Yes.
Are they outside? Are they inside? Are they in a dark space? Are they in a bright space? Just enough to let you know what the characters are experiencing that moment in a way that impacts the story or impacts the setup or impacts the exposition, right? And the counterpoint to that is, I think, you never want the background to steal from the foreground.
Right.
You never want the background to be so impressive that you're not paying attention to what's going on in the foreground. You never want the background to be so visually confusing that your eye gets lost about what's happening in the foreground. You always want, in a sense, to have the background to be a tertiary read, a third or fourth read to the foreground. Brad, what do you think?
For me, it's all about just underlining what you said. It's about what I'm trying to communicate at the moment. I do not slavishly feel like I have to have a background in every scene. I might have it in like, for example, a lot of the stuff I'm posting on my site is, as I've described before, a half page, and so that's usually about 7 or 8 panels, 2 rows, and in the first panel, I typically have a background because I kind of consider that to be a scene setter. The person coming to my site.
Almost, yeah.
Exactly. So it gives you a sense of place. After that, especially if it's a close-up and I've got 2 people talking, there's not a reason to have a whole lot of backgrounds there, right? Or if I do, maybe it's a very, very minimalist background, like maybe just a couple of lines to indicate the baseboard on a wall behind them, or the door frame behind them, that whole thing. So I will try to do that sort of thing in a very minimalist way, but I don't feel the need to have a background in every scene, particularly because at certain times you're going to be throwing so much visual detail that you're going to convolute things. They're going to miss the important things that are happening in the foreground.
Yes.
And something that also now this is something that Alex Heberling, who is the colorist of Evil Inc., who does an amazing job and always puts way more than I'd ever ask for. She's always giving 110%, that kind of person.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of times, if there's like a blank background and there's an emotion going on or there's something going on, she'll give me what I call like a dazzler background. Like if there's somebody who's in love, right?
Right.
All of a sudden, there's all these, and I didn't draw it in because it would look dumb to draw it with line art, but all of a sudden in the coloring, there's all these hearts behind them, right? Or there might be thunderbolts.
Or
there
haloing,
might be
or Kirby dots that are lightly kissed in. Yeah.
Kirby dots or jaggies or these emotive backgrounds that are just there. And the more I watch anime with my boys, the more I really have an appreciation for it. Because in anime and in manga, there's a tradition of even like writing a word that describes an emotion and pointing down to the character.
Right.
I'm not sure I'm ready to go all that far with it, but I do like the idea of using symbols and iconography and, just even abstract figures in the background to help do that. There's a lot you can do with a background that doesn't have anything to do with drawing the building they're standing in front of or the room that they're in. There's a lot you can do. But it's also perfectly fair if the scene requires it, just to focus on those foreground characters and to let them be the focus. It's really very much, if you watch a movie, you'll see the cinematographer play with what they call the depth of field, right? And sometimes when the characters in the front are very sharply in focus, the background is out of focus and hazy, right? And sometimes you see the background and the foreground is hazy. As cartoon artists, as comics artists, we kind of do the same thing by deciding on the level of detail or whether that background even appears or not. We kind of do the same thing, and in doing so, we help direct the reader's eye into what's important in the composition.
Yes, boy, you were saying a lot that I really agree with, and it's wonderful because as you're talking, like 19 different ideas that I want to communicate came out. This is actually a surprisingly good topic. Okay. So remember too that comics in this sense, and specifically with backgrounds, are like music. They're like dance. They're like writing. And what I mean by that is music, dance, writing, they all benefit sometimes from stillness, from silence, from the lack of the thing, right? And so where I'm going with that is, let's say you have a lot of big action, a lot of big, bang, bang, Iron Man's punching somebody, right? And the building explodes.
Yeah.
Sometimes you'll then have a panel where you're focusing, since I said Iron Man, on Tony Stark's introspection.
Right.
Then you want him on that bare stage of it's just Tony. Because if it's too much going on, he benefits as a director in that moment. You're benefiting the story by having silence, by having stillness, by having the absence of the world around him so that you can focus on the quiet inner moment that Tony Stark is going through, the introspection, right? And so much like music benefits from a quiet moment, much like dance benefits from stillness in the midst of a dance, much like writing benefits from varying your line length.
Yes.
So, for example, if I write a sentence where every sentence that I write has 8 words, and I write every sentence that way for you, you will see that it gets super boring.
Yes.
But if I dance the meticulous dance that is words and I let them play out in their own way, you see that language can become more interesting.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes.
If I change it up. right? So just by changing up the length of my sentence lengths, you see that stillness and it's a dance, right? And so comics, their use and non-use of backgrounds is a dance.
Yes.
Sometimes comics benefit from showing the character in their world, in their background. How do they inhabit it? And then sometimes you step away because it doesn't matter. It's what's in their thoughts. It's what they're saying that matters. And for then, you drop out your backgrounds. It's what they're communicating, right? Sorry, I got too excited about this, but I can tell you want to jump in. Go ahead.
It's a really great way to see that you're leveling up is to see when you establish the ability to know this for your own work. In other words, when we all started doing comics, we had to draw the whole scene because that's what we thought we needed to do. I'm going to draw the foreground, I'm going to draw the background. There might be something in the middle ground, and now I'm on to panel 2: foreground, middle ground, background. Panel 3, At some point, you can level up your work by making smart decisions on what to do with that background, and again, in some cases, that background's going to disappear completely, and you realize as you mature as an artist, you realize you don't have to draw the background. It doesn't have to be there.
And let's focus specifically on comic strips for a second. I've come to realize that some comic strips don't need a background because it doesn't matter if they're in a Starbucks. It doesn't matter if they're in their living room. It doesn't matter if they're in a forest. It's the idea that I'm communicating, at the most bare-bone idea of words and line art of characters. You don't need to know all this other stuff because then it becomes a specific which doesn't benefit the comic strip, right?
Yeah.
And a lot of comic strips are how badly or how much can you pare it down to get to the bare bones essence of the idea. And so I have actually come to found that a background complicates things unnecessarily, And sure, sometimes I'll throw in a background just because it's fun to draw a tree or it's fun to draw, a cute environment. But to Brad's point, you come to find as you get a little bit more mature, which Brad likes to say, and it always weirds me out when, you know why? Because you always, whenever you say mature, it sounds like, yes, Mrs. Ricardo, we're all mature.
Yes, the great Frank Nelson.
That's right. So anyway, I find this a fascinating conversation because it's an underpinning of comics is that a lot of comics is how much can you get away with how little, and the other is how little can you show and describe a whole huge world, right? It's those two dances, and backgrounds are like one of the best examples of how comics do that dance.
It's like, how I tell my storytelling students, keep your readers on a need-to-know basis.
Yes.
Right? You don't have to pile them full of details and then tell the story. You keep your readers on a need-to-know basis. Well, the art side of comics is very similar in that you can keep your readers on a need-to-know basis in that as well, right? You can draw them in the living room in panel 1. In panel 2, we know they're still in the living room. You don't have to draw that whole living room. Again, you can go minimalist and just draw the edge of the painting that they're standing in front of, or the frame of the photograph, or you can drop it out entirely. You don't have to keep reproducing that background over and over again.
Yeah, I think it's one of the fun things to experiment with as you go through the years. And much like lettering, much like your paneling, much like your coloring, it's one of those tools that as you get more comfortable with it, you'll see like, oh, this can actually be, weapon is not the right word, but this can actually be a tool that I can use to either include or not include to better the message of the comic. And so what a great question. I'm really excited that this one got asked.
This was a really good question. Well, listen, I'm going to go for 2 here. I'm going to go 2 questions in a row that I think are really good. This one comes in from our Patreon backer, Dave Lerner, who says, hello, B&D. My strip is a gag a day. Dave, we got to talk about this. We've got to come up with a better phrase. By the way, I'm not picking on Dave because everybody uses this phrase who does this kind of comic. Can we come up with a better phrase than gag a day?
You know what's funny? Until you brought this up, I've never really thought about it. Gag a day. Gag.
I'm gagging every day.
It is kind of like, so I do a comic. It's a choke-a-joke a day. It's every day is a choke-a-joke.
Choke-a-joke.
Because, like, you're right. Gag is weird. That's a weird word.
I hate that. That word is always, it's like, and
so Brad, do you consider yourself a long-form storyteller or a choke-a-joke writer? Which one are you?
I've done my fair share of choking, let me tell you, when it comes to writing. kidding. No, and not only that, but see, if a cartoonist says gag a day in a room, and there's another cartoonist in the room, that other cartoonist knows what the guy is saying.
Yeah, they get it, yeah.
But the three other people who are not cartoonists don't know what the fuck a gag a day is. In other words, a civilian, somebody who's not a cartoonist, when you say gag a day to them, they have no idea what you're talking about. I'm convinced of this. They don't know what a gag a day is. Think about it.
Not that we need to figure this out right now, but what would be a better phrase? Like, I do a joke-focused comic. I mean, unfortunately, you start to sound like a turd.
It sounds... We've got it. I'm going to put this out to the ComicLab listenership. What do you think is a good replacement for the phrase gag a day? And of course, that's a comic that doesn't necessarily have a continuity, although it can. But the whole idea is that every update, there's a punchline. There's a joke every day that it up. I'm going to put that out to the ComicLab listeners. Maybe they'll come up with something.
I don't know, though. I think my off-the-cuff choke-a-joke is the best way to... I think that's the best way to do it.
I do like choke-a-joke.
Anyway, let's finish that question. So what did Dave say?
So here's the conundrum that Dave Lerner says. Although my strip is gag a day, recent storylines have been a little more serious, but I don't want my strip to be too serious. For one thing, the basic setup is rather silly and will not support a serious tone. Any advice on how to stop a comic from getting too serious? Or if I should just let it keep going the way it seems to be going? So here's Dave's conundrum in a nutshell. He's doing something that's humor-based, but it also has a storyline. In this storyline, things are getting rather serious. But it's like, wait a minute, I did an update. There's no joke here. What's the problem? Or is it a problem?
Right. Well, there's a lot to unpack here, and let's get right into it. So first of all, I think we do a disservice if we don't acknowledge the basic, which is that a comic strip is not the ideal format for longer storylines, as Brad and I have said many times. It's just the format is wrong. In the same way that you can't do interpretive dance is not a great way to teach someone computer skills, right? Like there's just certain things that don't do things well, right? And so a comic strip is best set up to be an idea deliverer. And that doesn't always necessarily mean there's a joke at the end, although for the last 100 years, that's been the main way that comic strips have been used. But the basic idea of a comic strip is I'm going to use 3 or 4 panels, set up, idea delivery, and by the end of this, you will have an idea, a new idea delivered to you, right?
Yes.
And usually, again, 90% of the time, it's a joke. So in general, long-form stories don't work. Now, the way cartoonists have gotten around this, at least in the syndication world, is I'll do a week or 2 weeks where I use a continuing story through the comic, and by the end, we'll get a little tiny bit of an arc for 1 character or 2 characters, that kind of thing. So it's doable. We all agree it's doable. But for the most part, they tend to follow sitcom rules where they kind of end up where they started because as a continuing thing, comic strips don't tend to change and move aside from maybe for better or for worse. So that's my first thought. Brad, what are your first blush thoughts about this?
I'm gonna redirect a like little bit. Let's say that this person is not doing a 4-panel comic, but is doing something more similar to what you and I do, right? With like Evil Inc. is more than 4 panels, but I try to land on a punchline every day. With Drive, I know there's not a punchline every time, but I know the way you write it, you try to hit something important in that last panel. What if it was something like that? What would your advice be? In other words, it's not a 4-panel, it's a longer swing of panels, but he's still trying to find, he still realizes, like I've advised many times, a punchline is a great way to end it and make that moment significant, especially if you're obviously doing a humor comic, because that's a great way to entice that reader to come back again. What would your advice be then?
So I think I have 2 competing thoughts, and this will be a fun conversation. One is the first 10, 20, 100 pages of no matter what you're producing, the first 10, 20, 30 pages, 100 pages are kind of an implicit promise of what the type of story is going to be, right? And so if I start out a story with 3 Stooges kind of slap gag jokes, right? it's really hard to transition into a Russian novel. This is the winter of my discontent, and now we're all reading
Right.
Brothers Karamazov, right? So it's sort of an implicit promise. The way you start a story is usually a forecast of like what to expect in the story. That being said, we are all human beings. We all change. We all have moods and tones that, right? And certainly stories can change. But I think in my own experience, a story that drastically changes from what the implicit promise was, like Mark Twain's Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court, started off the most silly, goofy story that Mark Twain had ever written. And then Mark Twain's entire life falls apart, right?
Yeah.
He loses all his money. People die in his life. He falls into a major depression. That last 100 pages of that book makes no freaking sense compared to the first 100 pages of that book. It's a totally different book. They're like two books that got welded together, right?
I never knew about that. I remember reading that in school and hating it because it was such a disappointment, but no teacher ever pulled me aside and say, oh, listen, you got to know the rest of the story.
Yeah, if you know the context, you see why it happened.
Yeah.
But it still doesn't make the story in and of itself like a holistic, planned out arc of like, we're going to start silly, but then at the end, everything's going to be dead, right? That's what I'm... and again, a good storyteller like Twain can find a way to make it work, but it still doesn't live up to the implicit promise of the first pages, right? Now... that, like any relationship, you can grow and change, and if you and your partner can grow and change, then certainly a story can grow and change. But I guess what I'm getting at here is that the implicit promise is a somewhat understood thing between reader and artist. So just keep that in mind. Now, that being said, no one minds a little lighthearted or even a dark-hearted forays for small bits of time as long as there's a return. And now Dave is concerned, I'm changing it too much, right?
Yeah.
And so for me, a couple of questions have to be asked. Now, Dave's tone is interesting. The way he asked this, it's as though it is happening to him. He's like, well, that's where the story's going, or that's, let me find the wording that he says. Or should I just let it keep going the way it seems to be going?
Yes.
Now, that implies he has no control. He has no action on the control of this.
Right.
Part of this is Dave, for whatever reason, and maybe it's the fact that we're all living through a pandemic and a massive financial meltdown and a terrible election, that you're maybe feeling a little bit of the weight of the world, and that's okay.
Yeah.
But what I'm saying is you have action on whether or not you are creating silliness or whether you're creating seriousness. It's not just the comic doing it to you or doing it to itself. That being said, the muse sometimes is interesting, and if it's only giving you dark thoughts, sometimes you got to work with that, Brad. I feel like I'm falling into a rhetorical hole, so you keep going for a second.
You're setting me up for what I was planning to say beautifully.
Good, okay.
You're once again the best partner in webcomics podcasting.
Oh my
anywhere.
goodness, I'm blushing.
Such a guy.
This man in flannel is complimenting me.
I smell like pine too. You'd be amazed.
You smell like brawny.
I smell like that guy on the paper towel.
Yeah.
You're setting me up perfectly. So here's the deal. What Dave is talking about here, it fits into what I do in Evil Inc. constantly, which is I am doing a storyline. I am doing a long form story. I realized a long time the comic strip was not the way to do that. I do it much more like a graphic novel, but I try to end every one of those updates, which, like I said, usually are about a half a page, on a punchline. Now, the story in Evil Inc. every now and again gets very serious because a couple of years ago, I started challenging myself to write according to some of the narrative archetypes that I was teaching in my storytelling class as a way to not only to have something fun to do that was different, but so I could understand it even better when I was talking about it to my students. So right now what's going on in Evil Inc. is the tail end of what has been a hero's journey story. That obviously has some very serious moments in it. There's 2 resurrections that happen in a hero's journey story. That's hard to joke around during a resurrection, unless you really do it in an interesting way. So what this guy's talking about, Dave, is in my wheelhouse. And here's what I'm going to tell you. If you find that if you're doing something that's humor-based and you're writing a story and you're putting up things that aren't funny, then you are letting yourself off the hook way too easily as a writer. Kind of like what you were saying, Dave. In other words, it's not this case of, well, this is where the story's going. You're writing the story. And if you allowed that update to go out without finding the funny, you need to stop that. You do not get in general, I'm going to pull back in a second, but in general, you do not get a get out of jail free card every time you deal with a funny topic. By the way, the worst, the most tragic, the most terrible topics are amazing comedy moments. Why?
Yes,
because
right.
of the concept of tension and release. Think about that time. This was such an amazing moment. This is when this whole idea crystallized for me. It was the first Avengers movie, and I don't know if you haven't seen it. Spoiler coming up, but it's when Agent Coulson he found like this big gun. He wonders what it does, and before he has a chance to find out, he gets hit with a laser beam and is dead. And it's Agent Coulson. We've been seeing this guy for a long time. He died right in front of our eyes, right? And it was a tragic moment. It's like, oh shit, Coulson's dead. This is horrible. Everybody's jaw dropped in the movie theater. Things go on, bibbidi-bibbidi-bop, and then all of a sudden, Loki's about to unveil some unspeakable evil, and all of a sudden, zap, he gets blasted out of nowhere. And the camera zooms around, and it's Coulson still holding this gun, and he says, oh, that's what it does. And the entire movie theater erupted into laughter. It was a huge laugh. Right? Why? Because of tension and release. They gave you an incredibly tragic scene and then followed it with a joke. And those are powerful, powerful moments. Now, does that mean... Oh, and by the way, let's talk about another fantastic movie, Steel Magnolias. There is no funnier freaking scene than those four ladies in the graveyard having just buried Sally Field's daughter.
Yeah.
There's no funnier scene in movies than that scene that happens after that. Why?
Right.
Tension and release. So now, does that mean every moment is going to have a, punchline? No. But, like, for example, the thing that just went up on Evil Inc., Miss Match just got shivved in the back by her paramour as she was in the arms of Captain Heroic. It's a in fact, it's supposed to be a jaw drop scene. I didn't follow that. I didn't put a joke in there. Okay. But there are some that you just can't get away from it. That's where I said I was going to pull back. Sometimes you just can't, or you would cheapen that moment by putting a joke in there. But there's lots of ways you can do this. For example, another way that I've found of doing that is instead of putting the joke at the end, sometimes if you've got a serious scene, you can sneak the joke in the beginning and get that moment of humor, that dopamine hit that your reader is looking for. You can front load it.
That way you're not lessening the gravitas at the end.
Yes.
But you're balancing out that this is a full a moment. And frankly, that idea of laughter through tears or tears through laughter is really powerful and cathartic for human beings as social creatures. It's like we're sharing this terrible moment, but we're trying to make this manageable and livable. And that's what laughter through tears is. And that's what that scene in Steel Magnolias is we will lift one another up through humor in this terrible moment.
Comedy and tragedy are both based on tension and release.
Yeah.
So it's you can slide back and forth between those. You should be trying, if you're going to do a story that has any kind of depth, you're going to need to plumb those depths and find the humor in the depths. And again, like I said, there's lots of ways you can do that. You're letting yourself off the hook as a writer if you're posting things that your readers, for the last 10 updates, you gave them a joke, you gave them a punchline, you gave them a joke, you gave them a punchline. Now they show up today, there's nothing. Well, come on. You're like Dave said, you've set up a contract with these readers. They show up, they're expecting a joke. If you're not delivering that, and if there's not a really good reason, then you've disappointed them, and you're only going to get so many chances to disappoint them until they go someplace else where they're not getting disappointed. You're letting yourself off the hook as a writer. Go back there and find the funny.
Yep. And I will say this, the best punchline that you have will be remembered for years, decades, but sometimes the punchline that comes through tears is one of the most impactful that you will write. You'll have people coming up to you years later and being like, that one truly meant a lot to me because I had XYZ happen to me in my life. And boy, that being able to find a moment of levity, that life is still worth living, that, all that kind of stuff is really impactful. And so I would, in a way that I try to do with Drive a lot too, I try to push myself that even at a terrible moment to find almost that graveyard humor because that's the way that morticians survive. It's the way firefighters survive. It's the way the police survive when they find something horrible.
It's the way a lot of us have survived this year.
Right, or survived 2020, is that you've got to find the small moments of levity that lifts your heart in and amongst terribleness. And so now again, all this to say, not everything in life has to be a joke. There are moments of seriousness. That's not what we're saying, but we're responding to your specific thing here that you're trying to write humor. You find that it's falling into seriousness too much, and you want to steer back from that. So the reason I say that is there is nothing wrong with writing a story that is pure catharsis, the shared moment of tragedy, right? Yeah. Entire Greek cultures have risen and fallen for that entire purpose. But what we're reacting to in this specific moment is you started out writing humor. It's gotten more tragic. Now it's time to turn that back around to bring humor in through tragedy. And that you'll find that can sometimes be the most effective type of humor of all.
So, Dave, we've been asking some of our listeners who are not necessarily full-time comics artists or cartoonists who listen to the show nonetheless to tell us a little bit about themselves. This is coming in from Kay Rose, who is a wonderful illustrator. And Kay says, "Hello, friends. I was listening to the latest ComicLab where you asked again to tell us what we do in our job besides comics. To help my partner and I work as a UX designer. I currently work the normal 9 to 5 from home, and on my mornings, lunch breaks, nights, and weekends, I work on my own projects like my impending webcomic and graphic novel. Oh, I can't wait to see that. Being a UX designer teaches me a lot about comics, web design, social media, and how to catch people's eyes, and I am thankful every day that I fell into this career while trying to be a cartoonist. I even get to frequently put my illustration and animation skills to use on the job. Other jobs I've done, I scooped corn at a place called Magic Corn."
I scooped corn. There's a lot of angles to that phrase. I scooped corn.
Magic corn, no less. I thought all corn was magic.
Well, let's unpack this. What is that sentence? I scooped
corn at a place called Magic Corn, which closed without warning one day.
What do you suppose that means? Wait, I'm not trying to be facetious. What is that?
I have no idea what magic corn is.
So I'm imagining, this is how I'm imagining it.
Yes.
There's a store somewhere like right off maybe like the I-40 or something, right? And there's cornfields nearby, and it's tremendously desired corn, and they husk it, and then I don't know what's happening.
How would you scoop it? It has to be taken off the cob if she's scooping it.
Wait, what is the act of decobbing corn? What is that called? When you take a knife and you go down the side of it?
Yeah, it's not husking. It's shelling. No, it's not shelling. You do shell the peanuts. I don't know what that's called.
By the way, can we talk for 1 second, not to derail this entire nice compliment from Kay, but the best name of all for any sports team ever is the Cornhuskers.
The Cornhuskers.
That's like, talk about completely abdicating any kind of excitement in your life. Like, we're the Cornhuskers. Like, well, not the Pirates, not the Vikings, not the the Eagles.
Bearcats, yeah.
They're the Cornhuskers. That's like the potato preparers. We're the potato preparers.
If you're husking, now that's different. Is that where you actually pollinate the corn with the little silks at the top? Is that husking, or is husking when you take the wrappings
husking
off?
Is when you sit, and you're just tearing off the
very peaceful thing to do. Not very violent at all.
I find it really satisfying to husk corn, but not so satisfying that I want to name a sports team after it. Anyway, all right, so back to Kay's thing.
Kay had worked at Magic Corn, which closed without warning one day, and no one told me until I showed up to find the health inspector had shut us down one morning. So evidently that corn wasn't very magic.
Oh my God, I did not expect this to happen in Kay's story.
Yeah. Oh yeah, Kate's going off the rails here. Kay has worked in a few.
Turns out there was a meth operation in the back.
Oh, and listen to this. Worked in a few libraries, so who knows? Maybe she has been on the phone with Stan Lee with his overdue library books at some point.
Fantastic. Sorry about that book.
And at the reception desk of a car insurance company, to which I left to pursue my art career when I was told, quote, I'm sure they'll take you back. So that is what Kay has been up to.
That is awesome, Kay. Thank you for the kind words. And also, I need closure on Magic Corn. I need to know what they were doing there and why did the health inspector get involved.
Kay, you got to write back and tell us about that Magic Corn. There's a lot more. Yeah, you buried the lead there.
There's a story there, Kay, and I want to hear it.
The Magic Corn. In the meantime, that'll give everybody listening a reason to come back and listen to another episode of ComicLab, the show about making comics and making a living from comics.
Your hosts have been my own Magic Corn, Brad Geiger, the editor, that sounds terrible, the editor of webcomics.com, and the cartoonist of the creator of Evil Inc. at evil-comic.com.
And the husky Dave Keller. That's even worse.
Don't say husky. You could have said corn husker. You didn't have to say husky. That was intentional.
Oh, husky. Yeah, husky's a bad one. Co-director of Stripped and cartoonist of Sheldon at sheldoncomics.com and Drive at drivecomic.com.
Unfortunately, the phrase husky means a little too much because anytime I ever went pants shopping with my mom, they're like, well, for this husky young lad. I was like, husky young lad.
He's a little husky. I was thin as a rail. I had to gather a crowd just to cast a shadow. I would esteem to be husky one day.
Well, can I tell you, as a little boy that was on the husky side of things, you don't want to hear the word husky used. It was such a 1970s, 80s metaphor for like, well, we see someone found the ding-dongs in the pantry.
I was painfully scared. I had to run back and forth in the shower just to get wet.
Brad. This joke brought to you by the Roaring Twenties. Oh, my goodness. The ComicLab theme song is used with permission from Andy Creighton at theworldrecord.net. And this episode and all episodes was edited by our pal Matt Woodard of Woodsong Productions over at www.woodsong.media.
If you love ComicLab, you can rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts, and you may hear your review featured on a feature episode like this one. This one comes in, this is beautiful, Dave. This comes in via Twitter, all right? And I don't know whether the person wants to be identified, so I'm just going to read the tweet. I've been feeling really down and out about my nerve damage, but I've been listening to ComicLab podcasts, and it really helps reframe that I'm really young, and it's not the end of the world if I need a while to heal yet. Dave, this show has been helping this young person with their nerve damage.
Well, that's fantastic. Brad, you remember when I had nerve damage, I had what was called costoclavicular syndrome because I was basically rolling my shoulders forward while I drew.
Yeah.
And it impacted the nerve bundle that travels out from your shoulder. And I know that pain. You are not alone in that one. That is a unique thing. Rest and ice and heat will help out your arm. And remember that it's a slow process to repair nerves. I remember my physical therapist said one time that you can think of like in the healing process, Brad, it's like an eighth of an inch is healed in a nerve every week as you heal it.
Oh,
so it took me about 2 years to get back to normal.
Yeah. Because in your case, you've got a lot of nerve.
Bradley Geiger. This joke also brought to you by the Great Depression. This is Brad's tour through the Catskills of the early 20th century humor. And I'm going to say ComicLab is made possible by your support on patreon.com/ComicLab. So we'll go ahead and say that like the guy that came up with that ball bearing. Patreon.com/how about we make it out of steel.
Dave, I can't imagine why you wouldn't like a term like gag-a-day.
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 Wait, it's so funny because that's so 1930s, 40s of like, what gag you got for us there, Jimmy Lou?
Well, it depends on the day. It's Tuesday, I've got a gag for that day. If it's Wednesday, I've got a gag for that day. It's a gag
Why,
a day.
I'd say you're a gag-a-day cartoonist.
That's right, I am.
Zibadoo, buy war bonds.